Everyone's always talking about the Second Amendment and freedom, but there's another amendment that might be even more fundamental to a free society, the Third Amendment. No soldiers staying in your house without your consent. And with President Trump federalizing the National Guard all across the country, that quiet little amendment may suddenly become very, very relevant. My name is Shaunak. I've been a plaintiff's litigator for almost 10 years. That means I represent people, usually against big corporations or government entities, including where there are violations of constitutional rights. This month, President Trump federalized National Guard units to deploy them in Illinois. Now, federal court blocked that deployment, saying that it could lead to civil unrest and that the government's evidence substantiating deployment was not credible. This isn't just happening in Illinois. In Oregon, this month, a federal judge who was appointed by President Trump blocked President Trump from deploying the National Guard there, saying that the government's claims that they needed to deploy the National Guard were simply untethered to the facts. That's judicial speak for, are you serious right now? So with all this news about the National Guard, a lot of folks are asking, what is the National Guard and how is it different than the actual military? The regular military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, they are always under federal command. They answer to the president all the time. They are what we call active duty military. The National Guard, or the National Guards of the individual 50 states, are a little bit different. They're what are called the dual status force. That means that they are both active duty state militia and reserve federal units. That means that they can either be controlled by the governor of a state or the President of the United States, depending on what their current legal status is. Think of it this way. When there is a disaster in your state, a hurricane, a flood, riots, civil unrest, the state's governor can call up the National Guard to help keep the peace or to assist in relief efforts. When that happens, the Guard is under state control, enforcing state laws, and the state is paying for it. On the flip side, the president can call up the National Guard for federal missions, and when that happens, they are federalized. They are under federal control. When Guard troops are federalized, they effectively stop being state militia and turn into active duty military troops. When the president federalizes the National Guard, it's generally for one of three reasons. There's an invasion, there's a rebellion, or he's unable to execute or enforce federal laws with existing police forces. So when President Trump says that in a place like Chicago, protests and resistance against ICE are rising to the level of a rebellion, that they are preventing the federal government from enforcing and executing its laws, well, the court says, you haven't really shown us credible evidence that that's true, that you can't enforce the laws with existing federal agents, that you need military troops to enforce the laws. Here's why it matters whether troops are federalized or under state control, and it's because of something called the Posse Comitatus Act. Posse Comitatus says that federal troops cannot engage in civilian law enforcement. They cannot arrest, they cannot search, they cannot do crowd control, they cannot police unless Congress allows it. Earlier this summer, the administration deployed hundreds of Marines to LA to help ICE. Now, it later withdrew those troops, but just last month, the federal judge ruled that that deployment was unlawful under the Posse Comitatus Act because those troops were sent there essentially to assist in civilian law enforcement, and that is unlawful. So when National Guard units are federalized and they become federal troops, the Posse Comitatus Act applies to them, and that means they cannot police. They can protect federal property, like federal buildings or federal parks. They can engage in logistics support, but they can't do law enforcement. Now, if they were operating under the control of a state, if they were called up by the state's governor, Posse Comitatus wouldn't apply and they would be allowed to enforce state laws. There is one major exception to Posse Comitatus, and that is the Insurrection Act. In very specific emergencies, the federal government is able to use federal troops to enforce laws, to police. And this month, the vice president said, the Insurrection Act is on the table, and the administration is considering invoking it. So what does that have to do with the Third Amendment? Well, the Third Amendment basically says soldiers cannot be quartered in your home without your consent. Back before and during the Revolutionary War, British soldiers were quartered in colonists' homes. That means they would be sleeping in your bed, staying in your house, eating your food, and you had no say in it. When the founders wrote the Bill of Rights, this was a hard line. The government cannot force you to house soldiers. This is the most underdeveloped area of constitutional law. The Supreme Court has never touched it. There have really been no cases addressing it because it never comes up. And a part of the reason is because we have an immense military-industrial complex. We have bases everywhere, armories, barracks, contracts with hotels. There's just never a need for it. There is one case at the Court of Appeals that addressed the Third Amendment, and it's illuminating because it shows us that this right extends far beyond just homeowners and their houses. New York had a prison workers strike, so the governor called up the National Guard. They housed the Guard units at the prison in the correctional officers' housing without their consent. A couple of really important principles of law came out of that. The Court of Appeals said, 1, National Guard units count as soldiers for the purpose of the Third Amendment. And 2, it's not just owners. Tenants have rights under the Third Amendment too. Right now, you've got tons of National Guard troops stationed in Illinois, but not deployed. But what happens if they get deployed to Chicago? You're going to have thousands of soldiers in Chicago with no place to sleep. There is a process, federal buildings and installations first, and if those fill up, then whatever hotels and motels the Department of Defense contracts with, and if those fill up, then it's portable barracks and tent cities on federal land. And none of that raises Third Amendment concerns because the federal land is federal land and contracted hotels imply consent. It's permission. The hotel owners are agreeing to house federal troops. So that's all right. But what if that's not enough? What if hotel owners decide not to allow federal troops to stay there? What if they boycott the government's attempts to put troops on the streets of their city? Then what happens? Here's why it matters now. National Guard troops are being federalized all across the country. We've got the Vice President on Meet the Press saying the Insurrection Act is on the table. And we're seeing domestic deployment of military troops in a way we haven't seen in decades. We're probably the closest we've ever been to the Third Amendment going from a footnote to a full-fledged constitutional battle. The Second Amendment, and in fact any government action these days, has become so politically polarized that either people feel the government is always wrong or they feel the government can do no wrong. But I think we can all agree, and we should all agree, that the Third Amendment is fundamental to a free society. And so here, at the precipice of what very well could be a Third Amendment fight, I would ask that no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, no matter how you feel about the Second Amendment, you all unite, we all unite behind the Third Amendment. That this is a stance that can be bipartisan, that everybody can take, that everyone can agree that the government should not be housing federal troops in our homes, in our hotels without the owner's consent, in places where we live. That could be a hard line that we, the electorate, the citizenry, can take regardless of political pressures or political feelings. So there you go. That's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, watch some more. If you didn't, send me some comments and tell me you hated it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.